Well, as the kids say, destroyer escort, I hardly know her escort. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Locker. Towards the end of 1943, the world was engulfed in the chaos of World War II, and the United States Navy faced a serious problem. You see, even before our official entry into the war in December of 1941, American vessels were plagued by the menace that was German submarine warfare, a challenge that only grew more difficult to face once American ships became proper wartime targets for the U-boats lurking beneath the Atlantic waters. There were ways to fight against submarines, of course, but methods of detection were essentially limited to sonar, and the only real weapon against them was the depth charge. So, if the submarine saw you first, there wasn't much you could do about it. And according to legend, it was in response to this very threat that something strange took place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the latter portion of 1943. As the story goes, the Navy sought to utilize Albert Einstein's unified field theory for gravitation and electricity, allegedly published in the 1920s but then quickly withdrawn, to create a sort of anti-submarine camouflage for warships. According to journalist Andrew Hockheimer, the research was aimed at using intense electromagnetic fields to mask a ship from incoming projectiles, mainly torpedoes, with the added benefit of masking a ship's radar signature via the same mechanism. If the legend is to be believed, then the work began in June of 1943, when the destroyer escort the USS Eldridge was fitted with tons of experimental electronic equipment while docked in the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Included were two massive generators of 75 kilovolts each, 3 RF transmitters, 3,000 6L6 power amplifier tubes, special synchronizing and modulation circuits, and a host of other specialized hardware employed to generate massive electronic fields. The intended result? When properly configured, writes Hockheimer, this apparatus would be able to bend light and radio waves around the ship, thus making it invisible to enemy observers. Accounts vary somewhat regarding whether or not invisibility or just radar invisibility were the goal, but what allegedly happened went beyond even the former. It was 9 a.m. on July 22, 1943, when the generators were powered up for the first time. And at first, everything went as hoped. Electromagnetic fields were detected, growing more powerful by the second, but then something unanticipated came about. As the machinery on board the Eldridge whirred to life, a greenish fog was seen to slowly envelop the ship, concealing it from view, and then, suddenly, all of it was gone. Where there had been fog, there was now clear air. Where there had been a radar signature, there now wasn't, and where there had been a ship, there was just empty water, and the water line remained undisturbed. So, not only had the Eldridge become completely invisible, it was as if it wasn't there at all. For the researchers, this was the best possible outcome. Their system worked, and if it could be applied to the rest of the Navy, then American naval vessels and supply ships would be able to sail free of danger from any of the German wolf packs lurking beneath the waves. All that was needed was for the ship to reappear in working order, and of course with its crew unharmed by the experience. Unfortunately, when the device was powered down and the ship began to reappear out of the dense fog that once again accompanied it, it was immediately clear that something wasn't right. While the ship itself remained in perfect condition, the same could not be said for its crew. Sailors were nauseous and disoriented, and the Navy opted to modify the equipment and then swap in a new crew for future testing. And for the next few months, adjustments were made, and further tests may have even been conducted, though apparently none with the results so startling as the July 22nd experiment. At least, not until the one on October 28. At 5:15 p.m. on that day, the generators were turned on once again. Within seconds, the ship reached a state of invisibility, the only thing belying its presence being the faint outline of the hull where it displaced the water. And then, in a literal flash, the Eldridge vanished. As before, there was no displaced water where the ship had been only moments earlier. And it occurred to the scientists present that even if the ship was invisible, it should still have mass, and therefore the outline of the vessel should remain as a void. Curious to understand why that wasn't the case, they soon powered down the machinery, the Eldridge rematerialized, and at first everything seemed fine. But upon boarding the ship, any excitement turned to horror. This time, writes Hockheimer, most of the sailors were violently sick, but that was not anywhere near the worst of it. As the story goes, some of the crew could not be found anywhere on board, nor could anyone account for their whereabouts. But by far the most grotesque sight was the 5 sailors who had somehow become fused to the very steel of the ship itself. Then, in the days and weeks that followed, some of those who did manage to survive the ordeal began to experience further symptoms, such as paralysis or invisibility, and several were even reported to have spontaneously combusted, only for their bodies to for 18 days. More curious still, the researchers would soon come to learn that the Eldridge was seen off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, just seconds after it disappeared from Philadelphia, and that it had remained off the Virginia coast for several minutes before suddenly disappearing once again. Due to the nature of the results, which presented not only a completely unintended function of the equipment, but also a serious risk of harm to the sailors involved, the project was considered a failure, and all records were either destroyed or deeply buried. So far as the government is concerned, the Philadelphia experiment never happened, and anyone who said it did was suffering from mental illness. But, as tends to happen with government cover-ups, it was only a matter of time before someone came forward with their own account of the story. But before we get into the details of that story, I need to talk to you about our sponsor for today's video, Factor. We've been working with Factor for over a year now, and I gotta be honest, they are one of our favorite partners. If you've been watching the channel for a long time, you've heard the whole spiel before. It's over 35 different menu items. There's keto-friendly, protein plus, lean, vegetarian. There's a whole bunch of great add-ons that you can get, but what's really great about Factor is just the convenience. You know, I've got a really weird schedule. There are some days where I get up at 1 in the afternoon and then I am up until 4 in the morning working. So it's nice to be able to just go into my fridge and grab a chef-designed meal that I know is going to taste good, it's gonna feel good, and it's going to be legitimately nutritious because their meals are, of course, all nutritionist approved. So, you know, just being able to go grab something, pop it in the microwave for 2 minutes, and I have a full meal ready to eat right in front of me, that is phenomenal. And on top of this wide variety of meals you get to choose from that all taste good, you can also do things like upgrade to some gourmet options that come with things like filet mignon. You can get breakfast, you can get snack bars, they have smoothies. There are a whole bunch of different options to really fill out your diet. And another thing that I really do love about Factor is that these meals are never frozen. So when you get them, you don't get that weird frozen meat texture. The chicken is juicy, the pork is juicy, the steak is juicy. All of the food is good. If you can't tell, I'm a guy who likes my proteins, so I need my proteins to be delicious. So if, like me, you enjoy delicious proteins, or perhaps one of the veggie options instead, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50LoreLodge to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. Again, that is code 50LoreLodge at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. You won't find any literature confirming the existence of the Philadelphia experiment on any official government website. As far as the military is concerned, this is nothing but a hoax, a fantasy story invented during the UFO craze to capitalize on the exploding interest in science fiction and government conspiracies in the early Cold War period. That is, of course, what one would expect of any secret military testing with outsized negative consequences. So where did this rather discomforting story come from? The answer, shockingly enough, appears to be that it was the Office of Naval Research, at least in kind of a roundabout way. You see, in 1955, a package was delivered to Admiral Firth, the chief of the Office of Naval Research. The sender did not provide a name, so the only clue as to their identity was the postmark from Seminole, Texas. The outside of the package simply read, "Happy Easter," and inside was a copy of the book The Case for the UFO by Morris Jessup, published by Citadel Press earlier that same year. The copy provided to Admiral Firth, however, was unique in that it was heavily annotated and evidently by 3 different hands in 3 different colors: blue, violet, and green. Now, these were not simply notes in the margins of the text, such as those one would make while studying a book for personal or scholarly use. Instead, they were strange musings about force field experiments and fireballs, all written by 3 individuals referring to themselves as gypsies. Now, only one seemed to have a name, that being Jemmy, while the Navy took to calling the other 2 Mr. A and Mr. B. The unknown commentators, writes Hockheimer, implied knowledge of UFOs and their propulsion systems, and of at least 2 different alien races. They mostly responded to things written by Jessup, discussing it sometimes with amusement, sometimes with criticism, and other times still with mockery, and it seemed that the book had been passed between the 3 annotators several times due to the conversational nature of certain notes. For example, remarking on a passage in which Jessup opines that one self-confident, assertive, and arrogant scientist, backed by the tacit support of his esoteric profession, can deny the occurrence, obfuscate its record, nullify its import, and come close to convincing the 10,000 people that they did not see what they plainly saw. Mr. B wrote, "Such contempt for those badly frightened or strictly orthodox namby-pamby scientists. The shade of Galileo walks again in the name of better science. Will he arouse and enlighten as before?" Then Mr. A, it appears, responded, "No, my twin, he walks through clouds." Interestingly enough, the somewhat elevated vocabulary, with terms such as castigated and ostracized used correctly throughout the notes, was mixed with utterly objectionable grammar, with random words being capitalized and hyphens used far more often than they should be. On top of that, many words were rather egregiously misspelled, but from within all of the strange commentary, one very intriguing subject came up again and again: a Navy experiment in 1943. Now, the first mention came on page 13, where Mr. A wrote that, and I am going to read this to you the way it's written, "Anyone reading this book would have to know that electron quantums within molecular structures are similar in scope of field as planets' orbits. They would have to know that. Electrons in metal go across what in planetary systems would be billions of miles, leaving through a gravitational field, dead spot, or node, or vertice, or neutral, as this one thing is variously called. Realizing this as Dr. Albert Einstein did, it shows clearly how many solids may become energy or dissolute, and how they may pass easily out of visual scope instantly. This is merely one clue gleaned from Einstein's theory of a unified magnetic field through all substances and throughout whole intergalactic universe. U.S. experiments, 1943, on one part of it proved plenty." From that point in the book, the subject does remain dormant for a little while, until Mr. B wrote the following: "I am not adverse to saying that a force field can make a man to fly, for I have seen it done, and I know the cause of this flight and am not disturbed. Paris Exhibition 1951, scientist from Paris University demonstrated this. An app thought was sent to US showing this action." Mr. A replied, saying only, "US Navy's force field experiments 1943 Oct produced invisibility of crew and ship, fearsome results so terrifying as to, fortunately, halt further research." The same incident was mentioned again on pages 83, 94, 124, and finally 150, where it is directly addressed by the writer Jemmy for the first time. After briefly explaining why he believes that a colony openly established in US land would not be beneficial to their cause, the annotator wrote, "Thus now you see overall wisdom of Einstein's retraction of his unified field theory and US Navy's ship invisibility experiments. Results 1943, results of such uninformed tinkering seem to show that the correctness of his reason for retraction." Now you might ask why the Navy would pay this document any mind, and you would be within your rights to do so. After all, misspellings, poor grammar, and the generally odd manner in which the writers communicated would suggest that the work was of no material value. But for Major Darrell Ritter, something must have struck a chord. According to Hockheimer, Ritter brought it to the attention of Captain Sidney Sherby and Commander George Hoover, respectively an ONR officer and ONR Special Projects officer. After reviewing the book and discussing its contents amongst themselves, the 3 Navy men then decided that the best man to ask would be the one who authored the original book. And in early 1956, they invited Morris K. Jessup in to discuss the strange annotations. According to Hockheimer's research, Jessup told the assembled officers that he felt certain he had 2 letters from one of the commentators, which he later supplied to the office for comparison purposes. The ONR officers, writes Hockheimer, studied the 2 letters and concluded that the author's writing style, wording, and punctuation matched the first of the 3 commentators. Now, chronologically, that would be Mr. B, though it's possible that this was a reference to Mr. A given the application of the names. In any case, the ONR allegedly informed Jessup that his book, along with all notes, is going to be reproduced in a limited edition for circulation among some of our top people.
Who? Top men.
Jessup, for his part, left the Office of Naval Research bewildered and confused. But The office held to its word and requested 12 copies be printed by Varro Manufacturing in Garland, Texas. By the time this was finished, the annotated version of the book was nearly 200 pages long, all of them retyped and formatted by a Miss Michael Ann Dunn at Varro. And it included a 3-page introduction provided by the ONR itself. Now, if these 12 copies had been the only ones produced, it's very possible that the existence of the document would have remained completely hidden from the public. But the ONR was deceived, for another copy was made. Actually, about 115 other copies. So it appears that this decision, sending the document to a private company for reprinting, is what led to general public awareness of its contents. But that only answers the question of how the contents of the annotated book escaped confidentiality, leaving several rather important inquiries to be made. For example, how did the commentators know about this alleged experiment? Was there any proof that it took place? And why did they choose to use Jessup's book as their vessel? The middle of the 20th century was a strange time to be an American, with many things that we take for granted today, such as routine spaceflight, still a futuristic dream. Up to that point, human space exploration achievements included a 1944 German launch of the V-2 rocket, which reached beyond the Kármán line and therefore technically into outer space, followed by an American use of the same technology, which produced the first photography from space in 1946. But neither mission managed to place an object in orbit or even reach escape velocity. In fact, when Jessup published the case for the UFO in early 1955, the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik was still well over 2 long years away, though both Sputnik and its American counterpart mission, Vanguard, were announced later that year. All of this is to say that the average person had a much different concept of space exploration than we do today, and one that was filled with quite a bit more mystery. And one man who became infatuated with that mystery was a used auto parts salesman named Morris Jessup. To Jessup's credit, that's a rather unfair way of describing him, and in reality, he was considerably more of a Renaissance man than his detractors would lead people to believe. Born in Rockville, Indiana in 1900 to farmers George and Alice Jessup, very little is known about his early life, and what is known was compiled by Joshua Buse and released in 2016 in his article, Morris Jessup as a Fortean. Now, according to Buse, Jessup had a passion for photography from an early age, spent a year in the Navy at the tail end of World War I, and then attended the University of Michigan beginning in the fall semester of either 1919 or 1920. He also worked as an assistant in the astronomy department before heading south on an archaeological expedition led by Dr. Carl Guth in Guatemala and British Honduras, which is now the country of Belize. Why would an astronomer be on an archaeology mission in Central America? The Mayans. The Mayans did a lot of astronomy. So, by 1926, Jessup had actually secured a Master of Science, and in that same year, he became an instructor in astronomy at his alma mater. He did have a little bit of a hiccup in 1931 when he lost his position at Michigan, but he quickly found work of the same nature at Drake University in 1932, where he remained a member of the staff until at least 1935. I was actually able to confirm the latter details via several newspaper articles in the Indianapolis News and the Evansville Courier Press, dated to October 28, 1927, December 31, 1933, and January 28, 1934, and the Des Moines Register for October 22, 2006 corroborates them with citations from contemporary articles in the Drake student paper, The Times-Delphic. Unfortunately, Jessup's life becomes rather difficult to track after his apparent departure from Drake after 1935, which is the last time he appeared in their yearbook, which, yes, I went and checked also. After that, he appears to have moved into the private sector to work in the rubber industry during the 1940s, though this does not appear to have been a very successful endeavor given the state of his career in the 1950s. Whatever the case, something happened in 1947 which appears to have stirred him back into the world of astronomy, the Roswell incident. For those unfamiliar with the UFO world, Roswell, New Mexico was the site of an aircraft crash which was swiftly swept under the rug by the United States government. The official explanation was that it was a balloon, and then later that it was in fact a balloon equipped to listen for Soviet nuclear tests, but then again, the very same Major Jesse Marcel who approved the release of the story to the local newspaper, the Roswell Record, back in 1947, came forward in 1979 and said that the Army lied about it. We'll actually do a video on that down the road, but for now it should suffice to say that the incident caused quite an interest in UFOs, regardless of what the Army told everyone. And to be realistic, the Army telling everyone it's a UFO, oh wait, no it's not, may have had something to do with that. In any case, 8 years after the alleged flying saucer crash in New Mexico, Jessup published the first of his books on the UFO phenomenon, The Case for the UFO. Generally of much the same line of argument that comprises Ancient Aliens and other alternative narratives regarding the history of our planet and our species, I think Buse described it quite well, writing that the book surveyed a range of various anomalies and united them under a single unifying theory. Human civilization was much older than believed, and in the distant past, before some kind of cataclysm, there was a planet-wide culture, like Atlantis or Mu, which developed the power of spaceflight and levitation. Jessup argued that this civilization was either sparked by visitors from space, maybe the area between Mars and Jupiter, or gave birth to a race of space dwellers, to which he attributed megaliths such as the pyramids of Egypt and artifacts like the little piece of meteoric iron which was found deep in a tertiary coal bed, probably in reference to the Wolf's Egg Iron or Salzburg Cube as it is also known. The book turned out to be quite a success for Jessup, at least among UFO enthusiasts, and it could be described as one of the foundational texts of the ancient astronaut hypothesis, furthered by names like von Daniken and Sitchin in the following decades. In the immediate aftermath of its publication, however, not everyone within that community was particularly pleased. And on January 13, 1956, Jessup received a very strange letter in the mail, postmarked from Galveston, Texas, with the sender labeled as Carlos Miguel Allende and a return address in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. The letter began with the insistence that Jessup's invocation to the public that they move en masse upon their representatives and have thusly enough pressure placed at the right and sufficient number of places wherefrom a law demanding research into Dr. Albert Einstein's unified field theory may be enacted 1925 to 1927 is not necessary at all. Now, in the case for the UFO, Jessup never actually mentioned Einstein, but apparently he'd made some comments about this at a lecture in late 1954, or potentially very early in 1955. Allende must have been in attendance, and in his correspondence suggested that it may interest you to know that the good doctor was not so much influenced in his retraction of that work by mathematics, as he most assuredly was by humantics, which I assume meant humanity. Or potentially the humanities. In any case, Allende further explained that Einstein's unified field theory wasn't actually retracted because it was incomplete, but rather because later computations, done strictly for his own edification and amusement, upon cycles of human civilization and progress compared to the growth of man's general overall character, was enough to horrify him. In short, Einstein felt that his discovery would only bring ruin and misery to mankind if it were to be used improperly, and that humanity could never be trusted with that responsibility. According to Allende, this sentiment was shared by Dr. Bertrand Russell, who argued man would never be ready for this kind of knowledge until after World War III, but if Allende is to be believed, then there was one scientist who didn't fear the unified field theory, and that was Dr. Franklin Reno. Allegedly, Reno had performed a complete recheck of the unified field theory, which had produced good results, but the Navy feared to use them. Now, what were these results, you might ask? According to Allende, complete invisibility of a ship, destroyer type, and all of its crew while at sea. When did this supposedly happen? October of 1943, but that wasn't all. Allende elaborated that the invisibility field was effective in an oblate spheroidal shape extending 100 yards out from each beam of the ship, and that any person within the sphere became vague in form, but he too observed those persons aboard that ship as though they were of the same state, yet were walking upon nothing. In effect, those within the sphere were visible to one another, while those outside the sphere would see nothing save the clearly defined shape of the ship's hull in the water. Now, if real, such a technology, given some tweaking, could have been an incredible advantage in naval warfare, so why hadn't the government continued testing? Allende had the answer to that too. Half the officers and the crew of that ship, he wrote, are at present mad as hatters, and they were the lucky ones. A few, he continued, are even yet confined to certain areas where they may receive trained scientific aid when they either go blank or go blank and get stuck. Going blank, Allende meant that someone would spontaneously become invisible, which itself was not at all an unpleasant experience. The part that sailors who took part in the experiment had to worry about was the getting stuck, which Allende said the afflicted called Hell Incorporated. You see, when stuck, he explained, the man thusly stricken cannot move of his own volition unless two or more of those who are within the field go and touch him quickly, else he freezes. Allende's description of the procedure for this was somewhat convoluted, but he did say that if around or near the Philadelphia Navy Yard and you see a group of sailors in the act of putting their hands upon a fellow or upon thin air, observe the digits and appendages of the stricken man. If they seem to waver, as though within a heat mirage, go quickly and put your hands upon him, for that man is the very most desperate of men in the world. This was because someone who became frozen for more than a day would, upon being released from their state of paralysis, typically go stark, raving, gibbering, running mad. According to Allende, this was the result of the semi-comatose state in which a frozen individual lived, where they could live, breathe, look, and feel, but were still unaware of so utterly many things as to constitute a netherworld to them. The first man to enter such a state, the process of saving him allegedly took 6 months, at a cost of over $5 million in electronics. Now, thankfully, there were some warning signs before somebody would enter such a state, and Allende noted that you will hear phrases from these men, such as caught in the flow, or the push, or stuck in the green, or stuck in molasses, or I was going fast, terms which require some further clarification. Caught in the push, he explained, can refer to that which a man feels briefly when he is either about to inadvertently go blank, i.e. become invisible, or about to get stuck in a deep freeze or plane freeze. To be caught in the flow, on the other hand, describes exactly the stuck in molasses sensation of a man going into a deep freeze or plane freeze. The worst fate, however, was that of those who went into the flame, and these were the unfortunate souls who froze and caught fire, such as with the case of a man who froze while carrying a small boat compass. And it would seem that something to do with the use of magnetic instruments caused spontaneous combustion. To make matters worse, another crew member who attempted to save this guy via the laying on of hands method described earlier ended up catching fire as well. And if Allende is to be believed, these two men burned for 18 days straight. After this episode, we are told that the faith in hand-laying died, Allende writing that the experiment was a complete success, but the men were complete failures. Beyond these incidents, the author also noted two specific stories which he seemed to suggest were verifiable. In one, a sailor who had survived the experiment just walked through his quarters wall in sight of his wife and child and 2 other crew members, and was never seen again. And what's interesting here is that through was spelled in the same manner as Mr. B spelled it in his annotations on Jessup's work, written T-H-R-O-O. For evidence of another example, Allende instructed Jessup to check Philadelphia papers for a tiny 1-paragraph upper half of sheet inside the paper near the rear third of paper 1944 to 46 in winter, spring, fall, not summer, of an item describing the sailors' actions after their initial voyage. In it, Jessup would surely find a story of sailors who raided a local to the Navy Yard gin mill or beer joint and caused such shock and paralysis of the waitresses that little comprehensible could be gotten from them. And finally, in case any doubt remained in the mind of his recipient, Allende provided the names of men who had observed the incident from the deck of another ship, the USS Andrew Forsyth. These men were identified as a Chief Mate Mosley and a Richard Price of Roanoke, Virginia. Then, imploring that Jessup reconsider his position on Einstein's unified field theory, Allende finished with the request that Jessup do this bit of research simply that you may choke on your own tongue when you remember what you have appealed to be made law. Finishing the letter with the sign-off, very disrespectfully yours, Carl M. Allen, and his identification number, Z416175. And then he also promised to provide more help if Jessup saw use in it. Before Jessup could even respond, and perhaps even before he'd read the letter at all, another message arrived, this one sort of an appendix, which Allende labeled Notes in Addition to and Pertaining to Missive. In this follow-up, the informant took on a more apologetic tone, recognizing that, in all fairness to you and science, the Navy did not know that the men could become invisible while not on the ship and under the fields of influence. He also clarified that the Navy did not know that there would be men die from odd effects of hyperfield or within upon field, and further, they even yet do not know why this happened and are not even sure that the field within field is the reason for sure at all. So in essence, I believe what he's trying to say here is that the thought process was that when the field was turned on, sometimes a field would manifest within the field, he called this a hyperfield, and that if the field within the field would make someone freeze. So he was willing to forgive the Navy and science for that part. What he was unwilling to forgive, it seemed, was the previously unmentioned incident wherein one or two of their men, visible within the field to all the others, just walked into nothingness, and nothing could be felt of them either when the field was turned on or off. They were just gone. There were also apparently several other instances in which people disappeared, including one that involved an installed portable field developer, which raises a number of other questions that Allende unfortunately neglected to answer. The biggest addition, however, was the revelation that when the ship disappeared from Philadelphia, it was seen only moments later near Norfolk, only to once again vanish and reappear in Philadelphia. This too, Allende said, was noted in the newspapers, but he could not recall which newspapers or when it happened. Oddly, he offered the possibility that it was probably late in the experiments and may have been in 1946 after experiments were discontinued, but he could not say for sure. Now, what he meant by late in the experiments is hard to determine, as he only ever mentions the one that he says took place in October of 1943. In any case, he explained that to the Navy, this whole thing was so impractical due to its morale-blasting effects that the ship was rendered inoperable. In short, he wrote, ignorance of this thing bred such terrors of it that if, on the level of attempted operations, with what knowledge was then available, it was deemed as impossible, impractical, and too horrible. The remainder of the letter is rather difficult to understand, Allende suggesting that had Jessup been working on the project, and had he been aware of what he was just told, that the flames would not have been so unexpected or such a terrifying mystery. Except, immediately following this statement, he notes that, in all fairness, none of these other occurrences could have happened without some knowledge of their possibility of occurring, a statement which suggests those involved were aware of the possibility that all of this would happen, and therefore Jessup knowing about it would not have changed anything. Then, in a statement quite incongruous with the preceding letter, he argued that if care, great care, is taken in the selection of ship and officers and crew, and if careful indoctrination is taken along with careful watch over articles of apparel such as rings and watches and identification bracelets and belt buckles, plus and especially the effect of hobnailed shoes or cleated shoes, U.S. Navy issue shoes, I feel that some progress towards dissipating the fear-filled ignorance surrounding this project will most surely and certainly accomplished. Will be most surely and certainly accomplished. My bad. Anyway, given that just days earlier he'd mailed a letter insisting that Jessup never again push for the utilization of this technology, this was a very strange thing to say. But that didn't stop Jessup from replying, and apparently he took it seriously. Aiden! The mood lighting. Thank you. Dear Mr. Allende, the response began, your most remarkable letter, postmarked Gainesville, Texas, January 5th, was forwarded to me here today. This is, without doubt, the most remarkable report I have had out of hundreds of letters from readers of my book. I am retyping it so that copies can be studied by my technical associates, and would like all the information I can get from you about more details, and especially names and addresses of witnesses. This material is of greatest importance. Please write me at once as to your address during the next 2 months. If you are in Texas, I may want to stop by and see you when I am en route to Mexico. I will reply more fully when we have studied your report. Believe me, it is important and we must know more about this phenomenon. Thank you again. Very truly yours, M.K. Jessup. Allende's response came later than one might have expected. On May 25th, 1956, Jessup received another letter of considerable length, much like the first one, but which can be summarized much more effectively given what we now know. Off the bat, Allende balked at Jessup's request for a meeting, arguing that Jessup had asked him for what is tantamount to positive proof of something that only the duplication of those devices that produce this phenomenon could ever give you. despite Jessup requesting nothing more than a chance to discuss the letter in person. The author then doubled down, insisting that neither he nor the Navy could ever let it be known that any such thing was ever allowed to be done. Once again, a strange claim, considering the fact that he himself reached out to inform someone of it. Stranger still, Allende followed up by offering to undergo hypnosis assisted by sodium pentothal simply for the purpose of satisfying Jessup's curiosity. This recommendation, the line of reasoning behind it, and the suggestion that even more people be hypnotized take up most of the letter, and the argument can be summarized as, if we put enough people under hypnosis and use what I understand to be a truth serum, eventually all of the details will come out. In the end, Allende concluded the letter by offering that, perhaps already, the Navy has used this accident of transport to build your UFOs, something he saw as a logical advance from any standpoint. He also asked, "What do you think?" and this time signed off very respectfully, Carl M. Allen. So for the second time, Carlos Miguel Allende had used a different name in his valediction, and it was entirely unclear why. In any case, it must have been shortly after this letter was received that Jessup was reportedly called into the Office of Naval Research, and after that, he never heard from the mysterious Carl Allen again. 3 years later, Morris Jessup was dead. On Wednesday, April 22, 1959, the Miami Herald published a brief article entitled "Author a Police Say." According to the story, the body of Morris K. Jessup, the astronomer and author of several books on flying space objects, was found Monday in his parked car at Matheson Hammock, a park and marina in South Miami, Florida. The cause of seems to have been determined on the scene, based on the fact that a hose from the car's exhaust pipe to the inside of the auto was found. The article actually dealt with his work in a rather respectful way, describing him as the author of the case for the UFO, and explaining that he held to the theory that flying objects often sighted in the United States were scout ships or small expeditionary ships, which come from large motherships actually existing in open space. The most intriguing part, however, was actually in the second to last paragraph, which stated another book, also dealing with outer space flight, was before his publishers at the time of death. So, a UFO researcher who had just 3 years prior been called into the Office of Naval Research after receiving letters claiming to hold classified information, turns up dead by apparent in a public park just before the publication of his newest book on aliens. It was perfect conspiracy theory material, and it did not take long for those wheels to start turning. And those following Jessup's story noticed oddities regarding his death. To begin, according to Andrew Hockheimer, whose website has been instrumental in creating this video and is linked in the description, most books dealing with Jessup say something to the effect of, near the middle of April 1959, Mr. Jessup phoned and made arrangements to meet Dr. Valentine to present his evidence and conclusions about the Philadelphia experiment. But he never made it to the meeting, for on that night he committed by carbon monoxide inhalation. This was, according to Anna Genslinger, who obtained copies of the medical examiner's report on Jessup, something of a misunderstanding, though not by a huge margin. In truth, the Valentines, Manson J. Valentine being the Dr. Valentine in question, told her that they had been trying to reach Jessup for 3 days before his death to ask him over, for they were worried about what he had told them. What he'd told them, she says, is that he was on to something big. Based on prior discussions with Jessup, Valentine seemed to believe that his friend had concluded that the purpose of the Philadelphia experiment was to test out the effect of a strong magnetic field on manned surface craft, which was to be accomplished by means of magnetic generators or degaussers. The end goal was to create a magnetic cloud for camouflage purposes, and by his accounting, it would seem that Jessup believed the alleged effects of invisibility and teleportation were unexpected. Valentine also claimed that the Navy asked Jessup to consult on a follow-up experiment after his meeting in 1956, but that the man had refused because he was convinced that the Navy had uncovered a potential that could temporarily, and if strong enough, perhaps permanently, rearrange the molecular structure of people and materials so that they would pass into another dimension with further implications of predictable and as yet uncontrolled teleportation. So if this is to be believed, then Jessup seems to have died just after refusing to work for the government on a top-secret project based on an experiment that only he and a smattering of intelligence officers knew about, and immediately after telling a friend that he was onto something big. On the other hand, there seems to be a degree of skepticism regarding Genslinger's reliability. In one book, she's cited as saying that the medical examiner's report revealed a lethal amount of alcohol in Jessup's blood, while in another, she said that there was no trace of it. Genslinger eventually concluded that Jessup did choose to though not while in possession of his faculties, and that he did so because he was under some sort of control. Whatever the case, it would be easy to get confirmation of all of these details if someone gained access to the autopsy report. You see, in Florida, autopsies are mandatory under a number of circumstances, 3 of which directly match Jessup's situation. In particular, death by death when not attended by a practicing physician, and death in any suspicious or unusual circumstance. You may have already guessed where this is going, because despite the law and the objectively suspicious nature of his death, no autopsy was performed on Morris K. Jessup. Now, the given explanation was that Jessup had donated his body to the University of Miami School of Medicine about a month prior to his death via a letter written by hand on stationery from Hotel Ermey in Miami. Short and to the point, Jessup explained that he had requested the note be forwarded to the department upon his death, and that his wife was to be contacted so they might obtain his body. He also explicitly said that he did not desire any funeral services, and he preferred that his body be in the department's possession before relatives have an opportunity to hold a wake. The letter was dated March 20th, 1959, which was exactly a month before Jessup's passing, and this actually does make a degree of sense. According to botanist and ethnographer Ivan T. Sanderson, who was apparently a friend of Jessup, the man had, a week before his death, mailed a long and depressing letter/note to another friend who lived in New York. And Sanderson, who, as I said, apparently knew Jessup personally, said that the man was extremely distraught when they last saw each other, and admitted that, due to an originally pure intellectual interest in natural phenomena, he found that he had been sucked into a completely insane world of unreality. Jessup then expressed outright terror at the endless stream of coincidences that had occurred in his work and in his private life, but beyond this, he was distressed that he might be accused of outright insanity should he mention these aggravations and related matters. So, if Sanderson is to be believed, then Jessup felt very isolated and had become paranoid, and that wasn't the only problem. Sometime in late 1958 or potentially early 1959, Jessup was involved in a car accident, and this left him feeling like a complete vegetable even months into his recovery. He expressed these feelings to John Nebel, a friend of his who lived in New York, in the letter he sent a week before his death, even going so far as to say that he was going to take the risk of another existence or universe being better than this world. And for these reasons, Sanderson felt that there was no known reason to suppose that his death was other than and a carefully planned at that. Dr. Valentine held a similar opinion, though somewhat less certain, that being, if he committed it was probably due to extreme depression, related to feelings of despondency over the criticism directed at his books by the scientific and academic world. And in addition, author and UFO researcher Brad Steiger wrote that Jessup's close associates and friends cite despondency over an approaching divorce and a number of personal defeats as leading to his death. So it seems that a lot of people who knew him felt that was well within the realm of possibility or even likely. All of that said, one little issue does remain, which is that Sanderson wrote that the fake mystery of Jessup's was greatly enhanced by the false report that Jessup had been found dead in his car in a park. According to Sanderson, Jessup actually died in his own locked garage, and that, most unfortunately, no precise statement has ever been issued as to whether a pipe had been led to the closed car from the exhaust pipe or not. On the other hand, the medical examiner's report clearly states that Jessup's body and car were found in the park, as does the police report, and furthermore, the Miami Herald, directly citing the police, explicitly stated that a hose from the car's exhaust pipe to the inside of the auto was found. Why this specific item in Sanderson's version of events does not line up is difficult to say, but it certainly adds a wrinkle to what would otherwise seem like an open and shut case. And it's really not the only aspect that remains unexplained. You see, Hockheimer provides a list of oddities towards the end of his article on Jessup, several of which are worth a mention. One example, deriving from Hockheimer's analysis of the existing body of literature on this case, is the issue of identifying the body. According to the journalist, Jessup's wife refused to identify the body, saying she was certain that her husband would not have committed. Instead, the body was ID'd by a man named Leon Soule, who claimed to be a friend of Jessup's, though apparently nobody who knew Jessup had ever heard of this guy. In addition, Hockheimer was unable to find any published obituaries for Jessup, nor was I able to do so using the available databases. However, I did find that just a month before Jessup's death, on the same day that he allegedly wrote the note donating his body, the Noblesville, Indiana-based Noblesville Ledger published an article about residents who were visiting Florida, and listed in the second paragraph were Mr. and Mrs. Will Jessup, who were going to be spending a week with Mr. Jessup's brother, Morris Jessup, in Miami. One would think that if the brothers were on good enough terms for Will to make the trek from Indiana to Florida to stay with Morris for a week, then they should have been close enough for Will to put out an obituary somewhere. There's just a lot of questions here, and I will say that if Jessup's death was not a it certainly would move the needle more in the direction that the government was trying to hide something. But on the other hand, if it was a then that alone isn't evidence against the existence of the Philadelphia experiment. And to get to the bottom of that, we need to take a look at the man who caused Jessup to get involved in all of this in the first place. Carlos Miguel Allende, aka Carl Meredith Allen. In 1979, authors William L. Moore and Charles Berlitz published The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, and in doing so, placed the story into the mainstream more prominently than ever. At least one man took that personally, and his name was Robert Gorman, a journalist writing for Fate magazine. Now, Gorman was unconvinced by the general narrative about the experiment, and he questioned the reliability of the main source for the story, this mysterious Carlos Allende. The Navy, it seemed, had never been able to track down that elusive character. According to accounts published in popular books, Gorman wrote in a 1980 article entitled Alias Carlos Allende, when the ONR officers who had observed the Varro edition went to look for him at his New Kensington return address, all they found there was a vacant farmhouse. But Gorman would not be deterred so easily. You see, as it happened, New Kensington was his hometown, and in January of 1969, he'd been inclined to do some on-the-ground research of his own. But before he could get around to it, the Condon Report, summarizing the US government-sponsored University of Colorado UFO Project's conclusions, was released amid a flood of publicity, and that took precedence over any digging into Allende. And Gorman didn't even need to regret his decision, because late that summer, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization reported that Allende had dropped into its Tucson, Arizona office and confessed that the whole thing was a hoax. But it wouldn't remain that way. 10 years later, Gorman received a call from a friend and fellow journalist back in New Kensington by the name of John O'Donnell, who informed Gorman that Allende had recanted his confession. John's editor wanted him to cover the New Kensington connection with the affair, Gorman wrote, as that aspect had been publicized in Moore and Berlitz's book. And Gorman told O'Donnell what he could, and soon afterwards his interest in the story suddenly renewed. He'd managed to get a hold of a family friend of Allende's back in 1969, and so that was his first stop. And this man, identified only as Fred C., was able to provide the names of Allende's siblings, all of whom bore the same last name used at the end of each letter: Allen. The next break in the case actually came entirely by accident, with the disappearance of Gorman's own 5-year-old daughter, Kathy, while they were visiting family in the small Pennsylvania town. Thankfully, Kathy hadn't gone far. She was quickly found down the street, visiting with an elderly neighbor by the name of Harold, which, by the way, this is how most missing 411 stories in Pennsylvania go. Anyway, Gorman and Harold chatted for a bit as the former collected his daughter from their porch, and in the course of the conversation, the journalist mentioned that he'd made progress and had even made contact with Allende's brothers, at which point Harold interjected, "Donald and Randolph, they're my boys. I'm Carl's father." The old man disappeared into his house, and then shortly afterwards came back with a stack of envelopes, papers, books, and other assorted documents, all of which he offered to Gorman with a simple, "Carl sends us this stuff every so often. Anything here at all you can use?" And the answer was absolutely yes, because sitting atop the stack was an 8.5 by 11 spiral-bound book with blue pale covers, an original copy of the Varro edition of The Case for the UFO. For Gorman, this was like hitting the jackpot. He skimmed through the materials then and there, finding that many of the documents were newspaper or magazine articles, all annotated in Allende's distinctive style. And not only that, but the man seemed to annotate everything that way, even letters and birthday cards to family members. There were also copies of his military records, his birth certificate, and most importantly, a certificate of seaman's service signed by a commander in the Coast Guard, which bore the name Carl Meredith Allen and the service number Z416175. So this was, without a doubt, the same Carl M. Allen who had mailed those letters to Jessup all those years ago. Harold Allen was happy to let Gorman borrow the materials for his work, only asking that he not make them the target of kooks or reporters either, and that Gorman hide his real first name and location out of fear that the publicity could ruin his reputation. Out of respect for that quest, even though it's been about 45 years, I will be doing the same, but I can tell you that I was able to verify that this family did exist, did live in New Kensington, and can incontrovertibly be tied to the same Carl Allen listed under that service number. He was real, he had served on the Andrew Forsyth, and he did have the documents to prove it. But could his word be trusted? Gorman wrote that the prosaic truth, as his family revealed it, is as follows. He was born to an English father and a French mother, neither of them even part Romani or Gypsy, as he referred to himself in the annotations, on May 31st in 1925 in Springdale, Pennsylvania. Contrary to what one might expect based on his poor writing skills, his family agreed that Carl was brilliant in school and had a fantastic mind, but he never really used it, never worked anywhere long enough to collect severance pay, and had unfortunately become something of a drifter. According to his younger brother Donald, Carl was the kind of kid who could take a nap in class, wake up when called on, correctly answer a complicated math question, and then go right back to sleep. And not only that, but he'd easily become fluent in several languages. So, what was with all the strange letters and annotations? It would seem that Carl had a couple of issues, some of them cognitive and others behavioral. His brother Randolph told Gorman that Carl reads continuously, but the information gets all twisted somehow, perhaps as a result of some sort of undiagnosed psychosis. This seems very plausible in light of Randolph's comments that Carl scared his wife and that he had kids who had never met their Uncle Carl, and he planned to keep it that way. This angle is also bolstered by something Carl himself wrote, which Gorman found in a letter addressed to his parents and tucked into the copy of the Varro edition. Dear Mom and Dad, the letter began, enclosed is a book I co-authored with Professor Morris K. Jessup of the University of Michigan nigh 24 years ago. Of course, he had done no such thing. Jessup didn't even know about Allen's existence until the latter contacted him, and he was unaware of the annotated version of his book until informed of it by the Navy. It could have been an attempt to elevate Allen's status in the eyes of his parents, or it could have been that Allen genuinely did feel he and Jessup had worked together, which would be indicative of a delusional disorder. That wasn't the only important part of the letter, though, because it was followed with the instruction, do not ever part with this book, because its original price was $25. And so this book I helped write, alone by myself, with no Mr. A or Mr. B. This confirmed something that Jessup and others who had read the Varro edition always suspected, that Allen was the author of all the annotations. But this did leave the question of who Jemmy was supposed to be, as he was the only annotator to be named, the answer to which Gorman actually attributed to his wife, Trish. In her opinion, based on the mention of twins throughout the annotations, Jemmy was probably short for Gemini, and combined with the fact that Allen's birth sign would have been Gemini, it seems very likely that this is the case. All of this information pointed to one conclusion: the Varro edition was nothing but a hoax, or perhaps just the ramblings of a madman. Given that Carl's family said he loved to pull pranks, often without care for those on the receiving end, it seems very possible that it was also a combination of the two. And as for those who researched the Varro edition and the officers who handled it, it should be pointed out that, according to Gorman, the vacant farmhouse mentioned by Berlitz and Moore was never actually abandoned at all. Harold Allen and his family lived there the entire time, suggesting that the authors simply made that story up, or that they didn't bother to fact-check whoever supplied it to them. As for Carl's claims about what happened to the Eldridge, the fact of the matter is that there is simply no evidence to support them. Military records show that the ship was, on the alleged date of the experiment, in the area of Shrewsbury Bay, New Jersey, which is not anywhere near Philadelphia. Furthermore, the Andrew Farusith was in Bermuda at the time and had been since September 28th. And men who were identified as crew members of the Eldridge in 1943 even spoke to the Philadelphia Inquirer for a March 26, 1999 interview, confirming not only that the experiment didn't happen, but that they had never even docked in Philadelphia during their time on board. Former Eldridge crewman Ed Wise told Inquirer reporter Lacey McRary, "I think it's somebody's pipe dream," while another veteran of the ship said it never happened. McCreary was even able to track down Bill Van Allen, who was executive officer and then captain of the Eldridge in 1943 and 1944, and he told the reporter, "I have not the slightest idea how these stories got started." Now, I will say there's quite a bit more that could be said about the Philadelphia experiment and Carl Allen. There's so much material on this website, de173.com. It's linked in the description. It is Andrew Hockheimer's work. He did a phenomenal job. I could not have made this video without him. But I do recommend going and taking a look at it. There's stuff about Carl Allen's his death later on in the 90s. Some stuff that makes him a bit more of a sympathetic character. There's also some comments from his family, which are dark. But it'll also take you through all of the times that Carl changed his story, or Carl came forward and said that it was all a hoax, only to recant that later. There is a lot of evidence that Carl wasn't all there. And I did actually look through and try to find solid, concrete evidence that this had happened, but almost everything either couldn't be corroborated with any actual sources, or it all tied back to Carl Allen, who I think, as we've just established, is not a reliable source. So the available evidence only seems to support one conclusion, which is that this whole thing is probably fiction, created in the mind of a man who wasn't exactly in control of how he perceived reality. But then again, he did say that that electromagnetic field caused madness. Now, personally, being a Philadelphia native myself, having spent the entire 27 years of my life living less than an hour from the city, I have never heard a single Philadelphian mention hearing this story from their grandfather, mention being there when it happened. I learned about the Philadelphia experiment on the History Channel. It is not something we talk about here. It is not a local urban legend. It's not local folklore. And I gotta tell you, knowing as many people from Philly as I do and having family who were around at that time, there is absolutely no way it wouldn't come up. The only thing in Philadelphia that routinely disappears into a green fog is our hopes of a good Eagles season. This is a city where you run a legitimate risk of violence if you like the wrong cheesesteak place. People would be very serious about this. Also, I've driven past the Navy Yard so many times, especially on my way to sports games or concerts. That's a good way to get into the city, especially South Philly. If there were a giant green flash, a lot of people would see it. Also, like, if a ship suddenly appeared into the harbor, people would be more likely to throw batteries at the sailor's fuse to the hull than to do anything else. So, anyway, my point is, I don't think that this happened, personally. Neither does anybody else in this city. But, as always, I want to know what you guys think. Is this a story that you had heard before? Did you hear it from a person? Did Grandpa tell you? Was somebody on a ship? You know, do any of you have anything that could cause me to change my beliefs? Because it has happened. Looking at you, Missing Enigma. You beautiful man. Great channel. Great channel. Check out Missing Enigma. Nick does incredible work. That was not just a joke. I actually do think he's awesome. And if you would like more wacky, unhinged things that happened in history, I have a great piece of news for you, which is that we have recently launched a brand new channel with our buddy Stephen Bell over at History of Everything in Stakuyi. It is called History Unhinged. We sit down, we have guests, we talk about the crazy stuff from history, or we talk about the normal stuff from history in a crazy way. You can find that channel over at History Unhinged here on YouTube, or you can also check us out on The Weird Bible, a show that we do with Wendigoon, where we talk about weird stuff from the Bible. In addition, there is our weekly live podcast, The Lore Lads, which is right here on this channel on Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it's not, and if it's not, we'll tell you, like we did this past week when this video was actually being shot, because we just kind of ran out of time. But if you'd like to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, even when we run out of time, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/thelorelodge and subscribing for just $1 a month, and that will get you access to the exclusive program Liquored Lore, as well as things like the scripts from these videos, and any other kind of special stuff we do. We've got some stuff in the pipeline, we finally have a little bit of breathing room, and realistically the budget to do some of this stuff. And speaking of budgets to do some of this stuff, I just had to buy a Jeep Gladiator to drive across the country for you people. So, I hope you appreciate that. And don't feel inclined to give me money because of it, because I do this for you. That said, we are going to have a lot of fun outfitting that thing. I'm hoping that we can work with Quadratech here in Philadelphia. Quadratech, if you hear this, hit me up. I have some ideas. And Jeep, if you want the coolest commercial of all time, we're going to shoot it either way, but we'd like to give it to you. And maybe, I don't know, maybe receive some nice Jeep stuff. Give me cookie. But yeah, like, we're following the Donner Party trail. So, Jeep, it's a commercial that has everything you need. It's got a Jeep, and it's got the Oregon Trail, and it's got cannibalism. What more does your brand require? But what our brand requires is a lot of coffee, and we drink Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Co., a coffee that I designed. I was like, hey, Matt Moore of Tableau Roasting, I want these things, and he went, you got it, Chief, and now I have my favorite coffee of all time. I drink it every day, it's my go-to, and it's become the go-to for a number of you guys as well, and for that, we thank you. If you want to try picking up a bag for yourself, you can do so by going to the link in the description, that is tableauroastingco.com, and if you go down to the collaborations tab, you'll see us, and also, guess who? Stephen Bell, Stakuyi, History of Everything. They've got Lewis and Dark, give it a try. We also have merch. If you don't feel like drinking the lodge, you can wear our skin, and by that I mean bunker branding. Made in America, designed in America, and supporting us Americans. Now, if you are somebody who is from the 30% of our audience that is not American, I do not believe that there are tariffs on these products. And last but not least, if you want to keep up with what we're doing, get all of the notifications for when things go live, because YouTube doesn't like to give them to you when things actually go live, but rather when they think you're actually just going to watch it, which is not what people turn on the notifications for. Anyway, Discord, we have all of the notifications there. You will get them before things go up at the right time, so you know when to watch. With all of that said, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.